And so the fact that they're going to be meeting in Alaska is very significant. And my understanding is that the initiative to invite Vladimir Putin to Alaska is from Donald Trump's camp, from his administration. That is the one thing that the other side, again, I'm going back to the two systems of governance, that is the one thing that the other side, the European colonialist system of governance, has been trying to derail for decades now. And if you remember Trump's first term, practically everything was put in motion to make it impossible for Trump to improve the relations between the United States and Russia. To wrap up this whole answer, these measures, these developments, these talks are huge. Trump talking about being disappointed in Vladimir Putin, about how he's going to end the war, all of this, these are just misdirection propaganda pieces directed at the Western audiences to make Trump look like he's tough, like he's imposing solutions and measures on Vladimir Putin, like he's the alpha male in that combination. And that's purely self-serving for his own political reasons. But nevertheless, you have to try to slot him on this side or that side of the great geopolitical fault line. And so if he is in the globalist camp, in the colonialist camp, that would be obvious. But it isn't obvious. What is obvious is that he's moving away from that, and he's trying to make deals not only with the Russians and with the Chinese, he's trying to make deals with the Iranians. And I think that he will persist in this. But this is why I still feel positive about the policy direction of the United States under Trump. But the actual direction of policy development is very positive. And that's why I remain positive, even though I acknowledge that Trump is behaving in a very boorish way, that he is borderline vulgar in the way he talks about other people, other countries, and so forth, that it's very easy to dislike Trump at the personal level and then to distrust him as a president of the United States and the leader of the Western world. Now, last week I met with one of Croatia's leading military strategists, Admiral Domazet, and he has led the Croatian army through our war in the 1990s. And so I was curious, as a military person, his opinion about this. And the first thing he said when the summit was announced, and they didn't say where yet, he said, soon we're going to find out the place, and the announcement of the place is going to be a very important message to the world. That's very important, where the place is going to be held. They said Alaska, right? We didn't guess Alaska at the time. We were pretty sure it wasn't going to be anywhere in Western Europe. And so what does that tell you? That should lay to rest all those narratives that are talking about people in the Trump administration being stupid. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They're all over the place. It's chaos. I don't think that's the case either, because the choice of Alaska is extremely significant. Not only because that's where the two continents come together, where Russia and the United States share a border, actually, and Alaska used to be Russia, that the Russians, for very strategic reasons, sold to the United States. It's also where, for the past 150 years, there have been projects proposed and studied to connect the two countries together physically by drilling a tunnel underneath the Bering Strait. And this has been proposed by Vladimir Putin as recently as 2014. And in 2009, when he was, or 2008, I forget, when he was the prime minister of Russia, he approved a major infrastructure development project for Russia that part of it was bringing railways to the Chukotka Peninsula and make it so that it could be connected to the future tunnel that would connect Russia to the United States. And the Russians were proposing to pay 2/3 of that project, of drilling that tunnel. And so part of the reason for wanting to do this is not only economic development, but also, I think it was in the words of Vice President, not William Wallace, FDR's Vice President, Henry Wallace, who said that this would be very important to cement the future of peace for the world, physically connecting the two superpowers and bolstering trade and cooperation and mutual economic development so that you start cultivating friendly relationship. Vladimir Putin doesn't take offense. He doesn't care what people say about him. They've been demonizing him for 23 years now in the Western press. I don't think Xi Jinping cares either. But what they sign on the paper, what deals they make with the United States, that's very important. And I think that Trump certainly believes that he can manage all this. And I think that he's probably right about that and I think that he's already made himself a lot more powerful than he was in his first term, partly by passing the big, beautiful bill, partly by bringing Elon Musk to his side and X changing hands from the globalist to a different manager. We have basically X is now the leading source of news for many people around the world. He's less vulnerable to the propaganda effect. The fact that they're meeting in Alaska tomorrow on Friday, 15th August, tells you that they've already agreed on a lot of important points. Otherwise, Trump and Putin wouldn't be meeting to say, hey, what are we going to do? This is all so messy. Their delegations, their representatives have already discussed a lot of these things extensively. And the fact that they were able to put this summit on so quickly tells you that they found it easy to agree on some very important issues that are important both to the Russians and to the Americans. Then I think that another score has been outing of the Russiagate documents. And I think that a very important lever of power are the Epstein files, which the administration has in their hands. And I think that they opted, instead of releasing it to the public, to use it as a political leverage. And then this week, over the weekend, he took control of Washington, D.C. He put the control of the security of Washington, D.C. under the federal government. So the mayor and the Metropolitan Police in Washington, D.C. are now controlled by the Attorney General and by extension by Trump. And so he has very much consolidated his political power in a much more robust way than he did in his first term. In his first term, he simply didn't. So he was being constantly 24/7 attacked, not only in the media and demonized ad nauseum, but he was also being constantly attacked through lawfare, through these endless impeachment proceedings and trials. And so he was politically very weak. This is not the case anymore. But the key moment will be the midterm elections. So the Republicans loyal to Trump need to retain control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I think that this is part of the reason why Trump is going around making himself the winner in every situation. And he's making peace here and there, improving the economic performance in the United States, and all of these things that he's constantly very boastful about. I think that's aimed at further consolidating his political position at home. And that is, I think, from his point of view, the most important priority for his government. I think that the leaders in Russia and in China and elsewhere understand this. They're not stupid. And so they understand that a lot of his bravado, a lot of his, let's call it, boorish pronouncements to the public, to the press, they serve this purpose. And I think that they don't care. And I know people will say the United States is not agreement capable and you can't trust them as far as you can throw them and so on and so forth. But having a deal is better than not having a deal, because a deal gives you at least some leverage. Yeah, maybe some future administration is going to come in and they're going to say, we don't recognize this, we're walking back out of this. But there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot to be gained for all sides, not only in terms of economic development, trade, scientific, cultural exchange, and all of these things, and peace, but also in terms of nuclear disarmament, which is another thing that Trump has mentioned a few times and people in his administration. And it is clear that whatever deal happens between the United States and Russia, they're going to be working out some kind of a nuclear disarmament deal. in the future. I think these are very important things, and I think that he will be able to manage it because his key counterparts aren't paying attention to the psyops and the pronouncements that are aimed at domestic audiences. They're paying attention of what's being brought to the table and what's being discussed. That is so obvious that I think it's impossible that people in the Trump administration, if they have brains, if they have even average IQ, that they would be insisting on unconditional ceasefire and making that a condition for talking deals with the Russians. So obviously the fact that they keep talking about this unconditional ceasefire is a psyop. Obviously, it's not obvious, but that's how I perceive it. Because it's too stupid otherwise. It's just so spectacularly stupid that I cannot take it at face value. So my inclination is to think there's a different kind of a deal going on behind the curtains, behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the United States remains allied with the Kurds, not the Turks, not the HTS, with the Kurds. And Kurds are mortal enemies of the Turks. And then also there's still remnants of the Free Syrian Army that are backed by the United States, which are also at odds with HTS. So it's a huge, giant mess. Now, how did this mess happen? And how did the Brits get the Turks to incubate HTS and turn against Syria and Bashar al-Assad's regime? They promised them support for the Greater Turania project. And the Greater Turania project is meant to unite in some way all the Turkic people that goes, it's all the stans across the Central Asia, all the way to Turkey. So you have Turkey, then you have Armenia, and then you have Azerbaijan, which is a Turkic country. And then you have Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and all the way to China. It's Turkic people. That's the Greater Turania project. And so Erdogan, I think, was seduced by the idea that he might emerge as the great uniter of the Turkic people across Eurasia. And that would put him in an extremely powerful position as a gatekeeper of Eurasian integrations. And so now this whole project of uniting the Greater Turania has a weak link, which is the land corridor between Turkey and Azerbaijan, which is called the Zangezur corridor. And so now by inserting yourself exactly there, you're now in a position to be the gatekeeper, which means that you have the Turks by the short hairs, because the whole Greater Turania project hits a brick wall at that point, unless the Americans say go. But what concessions are they going to ask to allow that Greater Turania project to go ahead? I think it's really put the Turks in a very embarrassing position. And one thing I've also observed over the last few months is that Turkey has vanished from the headlines. There's this flurry of diplomatic activity going on between Azerbaijan, Armenia, Iran, China, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Everybody's flying all over the place. They're meeting, they're holding summits, they're signing treaties, they're doing stuff. Nobody seems to be talking to Erdogan. The Chinese are not going to Ankara. Erdogan's not going to China. He's not going to Moscow. The Russians are not traveling to. Nobody's talking to the Turks. The Americans are not talking to the Turks. And I think that this is what the British intelligence used to seduce him to back their colonialist project for the Middle East. And in fact, I think this is not even a conspiracy theory. The head of the MI6, I think he's still the head of the MI6. There's an incoming new head of the MI6, the woman, I forget her name. But up until very recently, or up until now, the head of the MI6 has been Sir Richard Moore. Sir Richard Moore was the British ambassador in Ankara for a few years, I think about 4 years' time. He speaks fluent Turkish. He is close friends with Erdogan. And he has been the one trying to recruit Turkey into not only their Middle Eastern project, but also their Ukraine project. They really wanted Turkey to make part of the coalition against Russia together with Ukraine, which thanks to the very skilled diplomacy on the Russian side, they managed to sideline Turkey and keep them out of that war for the most part. But they did proceed with the Syria project along with the Brits. And this, I think, has vexed the Americans very much. And now they're on hostile terms with the Turks. Look, I think that Trump now has a piece of paper in his hands. And that piece of paper gives him a certain negotiating leverage with respect to Russia, with respect to Iran, and also with respect to Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Armenia. So he's just inserted himself there in the middle of it. And he's almost like the gatekeeper now by that piece of paper. Now, can the United States enforce that agreement? I don't think they can. But let's set that aside. There's a widespread assumption that Trump's position there will be antagonistic to Iran and to Russia. That's possible. And I'm sure that he's going to milk it for all that it's worth. He's going to say, hey, you want to deal with us? We're going to need these following concessions and blah, blah, blah. He's going to try 100%, of course. So it seems to me that Turkey bought into a cockamamie, insane British military misadventure in Syria, and the result has been that they find themselves isolated. And so when the Americans insert themselves to take control of the Zangezur corridor, I think they're going to use that leverage to obtain concessions from Iran and from Russia. But I think that the move was actually targeted against Turkey. I think the United States is very upset with Turkey over the taking down of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Because, as we now know, but the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in the space of 9 days in December of last year was a big mystery, because a proper military of 250,000 troops with an air force, with tanks, with heavy artillery, with fortifications in strategic places and so forth, folded in the space of 9 days to a force of maximum 30,000 jihadis armed with light weapons and on pickup trucks. They raided the country and they got all the way to Damascus and met almost no opposition. And so I thought, this just can't be. This must be some kind of a trap. And it turns out that very probably the decision was made by the Russians, that they gave the order through Syrian Arab army's generals to just simply not put up any resistance and to evacuate. And so what I know now is that we knew this before, that part of the Syrian Arab army evacuated to Iraq, but I also learned that a part of it evacuated to Iran, and that they're still there, and that they are still a viable fighting force waiting for the right moment to go back to Syria. But here's where I see a more likely scenario. I think it's aimed at Turkey, and I'll explain why. Because, you see, the United States people are assuming that Turkey and the United States are allies because they're both in the NATO, and Turkey is the second largest military force in NATO after the United States. And it's a big country. It's a powerful, important country, blah, 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 all of these things. But if you look at the statements coming out of the Trump administration for the last 6 months, they're practically in openly hostile terms with Turkey. And so what we also learned recently is that the Turkey, which controls HTS, has been completely working on this project in cooperation with the British intelligence. The Turks were in charge of HTS and the military assault, but the British are in charge of the strategy and the let's call it the policy aspects of the whole project. Iran has the power to wipe out all 22 American military bases in the Middle East and to sink their aircraft carriers. They didn't do that. They destroyed a radar station in Qatar, which was a very accurate, very effective strike, but with pre-announcement so that all the troops could be moved out of the way, and they sustained no casualties. And case in point is exactly Iran's nuclear program. And Trump's umpteenth time insisting that the correct word for what happened was that the nuclear program was obliterated. Why is he saying that? The reason why he's saying that is because Iran's nuclear program was exactly the same issue as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003. It creates a justification and a pretext, but the nuclear program itself is not the objective of Western military intervention. The objective is regime change. Trump doesn't want regime change. He is effectively saying, I have obliterated your justification for war on Iran. It's no longer there. We have no reason to go to war against Iran anymore. And so everything stopped on one missile attack, one bombing raid, and then a very symbolic, very polite retaliation by Iran, which made it obvious that they talked to each other, that they said, look, very sorry, we have to do this. It's going to happen in 48 hours, so please move anything valuable out of the way. We're going to drop a couple of bombs. We're going to declare victory. We understand you have to retaliate, but please let us know so we can make sure that there are no casualties. The reason why they keep the appearance of supporting Israel is because domestically they have a very important, very powerful, and very fanatical voting bloc devoted to Israel, and you can't go against them. You can't take them head on and to say, you know what, you're precious Israel, we're just going to flush it down the toilet. So you have to go through the motion of pretending to support Israel while allowing it to drown, giving it time, giving it the rope that they need to hang themselves with. And so now it may appear that the United States government is completely devoted to Israel, that it's a make Israel first, make Israel great again kind of administration, that Israel is more important than the United States. That's how it appears. I do not trust those appearances because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Let's take Israel, for example. So Israel is completely the product of Western colonialism. It's a colonialist settler project set up by the British Empire when its last incarnation was dying. And they prepared the ground for the creation of Israel starting in the second half of the 1800s of the 19th century. Then we had Balfour Declaration. We had Sykes-Picot drawing of the maps in the Middle East, creation of artificial nations. In 1916, we had Balfour Declaration in 1917. And then we had the creation of Israel in 1948. Israel is dying. Israel is at the end of its rope. Again, remember Henry Kissinger, 2012, he said, 10 years from now, there will be no more Israel. It's not just Henry Kissinger. It was all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies made a major study on the question of Israel. And in 2012, they published an 82-page report, which came to an unequivocal conclusion that the interests of Israel and the interests of the United States are practically polar opposites, that it doesn't work. And again, the same reality that I mentioned for the United States, you have the mindset and vested interest and the positions that have been entrenched for decades, that you can't just dislodge like that by saying, okay, now we're going to be best friends with the Chinese and we're going to completely neglect our relations to the United States and Western Europe, because you have a lot of Indians who are in Western Europe who went to Oxford and Cambridge and became integrated into this Western system. You have many Indians in Canada. And so these liaisons still to a large extent determine the foreign policy conduct of Indian leadership. But I think that in a way, Trump is making them, the pro-Western Indians, he's weakening their side and their arguments, and he's strengthening the arguments of those people who say, no, we need to completely commit to BRICS. We need to shift our commerce away from Western financial system, away from SWIFT to these new emerging markets and the payment systems and new currency systems. And so I think in the long term, it's going to only strengthen the multipolar integrations at the expense of the Western Empire. I think it's going to push India deeper into, it's going to strengthen their commitment to BRICS. It's going to give them an incentive to make nice with China. They've already patched up that relationship to a good extent, but it's going to give them more of an incentive to make nice with their neighbors and not rely on the United States. India has been widely perceived as prevaricating between the BRICS and the multipolar integrations, and on the one side and the Western world on the other side. And usually that's the result of political realities at home. It's not necessarily that Modi is like Erdogan, guy who wants to sit on two chairs at the same time, but you'll have part of the political spectrum who is very pro-West, and the other part that sees the writing on the wall and says, look, we have to change course in our policy because the West is going nowhere, and we're going to end up in all these wars that are being cooked up for us. And again, I go back to, why is nobody talking to Erdogan? Why is Erdogan not talking to anybody? 2 days ago, we learned that Al-Jolani has reached out to the Russians to ask their protection, to ask them to diffuse the tensions between the current jihadi government in Damascus and the Israelis. But why didn't Erdogan call Vladimir Putin for that reason? That's very strange that Erdogan is just like missing in action. And so I think that Israel is circling the drain. Their economy is in shambles. The government is failing. Their troops are exhausted. Desertions are rising high. Iran's attacks have heavily damaged their infrastructure. And I think that all three of their large ports now are very, very heavily damaged. And the trade has dwindled down to a minimum. And now they're still active on 7 fronts, and they want to open the 8th one against Pakistan. It's going nowhere, and I think that Netanyahu is just trying to keep himself relevant and alive. And just this morning, I saw that he came out in public saying that his life is now being threatened. He's fearing for his life. And I think that reaching for the Greater Israel card is to reassert his leadership and to ask people to believe in something that he's fighting for, even though he's not fighting for that. He's fighting for himself. He's just appealing to the most fanatical side of the Zionist settlers who are fighting for Greater Israel.